Hey, this is Jim DeFelice, and you are listening to the Break It Down show, which, I have to point out, recently reached its 1,000th episode, which is totally amazing, and yet even more amazing, there are still things to be broken down. And so the show continues. And today's episode happens to be with Dan McLaughlin, who you may know, writes for the National Review. He's not here to talk about politics, or at least not politics of the governmental kind. He and Pete are going to discuss the Baseball Hall of Fame. So let's give a listen and see how long they can go without dissing the New York Yankees.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Dan McLaughlin, and you are watching The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
I almost had you on recently for a baseball thing, but schedules and emails and all that kind of stuff kind of conspired against us. So I'm glad to get you one-on-one so we can talk a little bit about this. Your day job is a senior writer for the National Review, and we can say the words Trump, Biden, we're not happy, and be done with all that. Let's talk baseball, because that's another thing that you're known for, and you've blogged about baseball for, basically as long as there's been blogs, for a long, long time. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, I started long time readers know this, but yeah, I started doing baseball blogging in 2000. So back for Bill Simmons' website back when he had his own site before he went to ESPN. So
as we start to redefine who's eligible to vote for the Hall of Fame, great, you work for, whatever, the Sacramento Bee, or whatever it's going to be, but they're starting to get folks from FanGraphs. Jaffe's got a role this year, able to vote this year. What are your thoughts? Like, should they open that up even more? You've got a pedigree of writing about this and covering baseball for, 20 years. Is that going to at some point be good enough? All these blog sites that cover teams specifically, are just treasure troves of specific knowledge. There seems to be like there's some validity there that they're actually doing good work.
yeah, you have to remember though that the voting process works on two levels, right? Which is, on the one hand, it's the question of, who ought to be voting, but it's also a question of, who does the BBWAA want to let in? And kind of voting for the Hall is kind of a perk of membership in that sense. So, and I think the working writers who work for newspapers don't really want to consider themselves competitors of bloggers. I think their reasons for not wanting that today are somewhat different than they were 20 years ago, right? 20 years ago, they would have said, well, you guys are just anonymous scribblers in your basements, and we travel with the team, and we're professionals. Whereas I think probably today it's more a matter of we are hanging by our fingernails to a declining number of perches in a declining industry. And the last thing we want to do is open that up to competition, because, the newspaper business is tough today. And so that, I think those guys feel kind of embattled the way almost everybody in journalism does on one level or another these days.
Yeah, I can definitely appreciate that. The number of local newspapers has shrunk to not zero, but it's trending towards zero pretty fast. And then I would gather that there are a number of bloggers who have bigger audiences than the reporters who work for those papers. I don't know, that there's a blogger that has more readers than the New York Times sport writer for whatever sport it is, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was.
Yeah, well, I kind of national papers like the Times and the Washington Post, I'm not sure what their audience really is for sports, if it's the same kind of audience they draw for their other material. But I do think that the local beat writer for the local team it's really one of the tent poles keeping local journalism from dying completely, actually. Because that's definitely something people are still going to want a local angle on.
Yeah, and I guess less likely now than ever that someone could become a writer for the whatever paper it is, smaller paper with a team, and then 25 years later, that person's still there. It seems like these are transitionary roles now where, I write for, the Chronicle about the A's, and then you're like, I got a better gig. I'm leaving, or whatever. That happens more now than it's ever happened before.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that happens a lot more now in local news too, not just local sports news. Talking politics, we go back far enough. We have had one president who was a local sports guy, and he was, when Ronald Reagan did broadcasting for the Cubs, he was not a Chicago guy. He was working in Des Moines doing radio broadcasts for the local audience there who couldn't get out to Wrigley.
Yeah, that's true. That's right. Yeah. Politics and sports go way back. I mean, presidents throwing out first pitches. There's a lot of intertwinement. What are your thoughts in general in terms of the Hall of Fame on these secondary voting committees that look at, Negro League players, executives, contributors to the game? A lot of times they struggle to put anybody in, and then sometimes they put Harold Baines in. So what are your thoughts on this second tier of voting that's available?
Yeah, it's not. They don't have a good record. I mean, the Negro Leagues committee. First of all, look, I really think that it's time to close up shop and close the doors on sort of the pre-1945 period generally for the Hall. Now, maybe you need to focus the mind and say, okay, there's some more people in the Negro Leagues who got neglected, but fundamentally, I think that whole time period is certainly in the major leagues. Sort of what was defined as the major leagues until a week ago. In the major leagues, they're overrepresented that time period. And there's no point, and everybody's dead. There's no point in putting guys in anymore. So I really think they ought to be just closing the, and I think that ought to have a kind of a statute of limitations that says, look, a rolling statute of limitations that says, look, if it's, more than like 70 years ago, that you're no longer eligible. Just because one of the fundamental things about the Hall, and I think this goes into the question, is a lot of this goes into the admissions criteria, but part of the essential nature of the Hall is that you don't go out, right? You come in, but you don't get taken out. Well, the fact of its permanence, that permanence is part of the concept, I think also should limit your how often you just go in forever back to the well of, I mean, did they get right all of the 19th century ball players? I don't think so. I think there's still some people you can make a case for. And there's definitely people in from that period you can make a case against. But what's the point now of going back and saying, well, we're going to put Bob Carruthers or Ross Barnes or Bill Dolan in the Hall of Fame? It's over. They've all been dead. Everybody who ever met them is dead.
Yeah.
It's that you made your calls and you move on.
Bill Dolan. Nice pull. If we're going to close down the Negro League section in terms, because you're right, at what point do you stop considering more and more archaic or more passed over players? At some point you are done, and it's kind of hard to say it. It's never easy, but Buck O'Neill's not in. It would be nice to see him get in considering his overall contribution. There's probably a handful of other Negro League type people that you could put in, but just say, one fell swoop, these 5 people, everybody else, write a book about them, make a movie about them, do something else, but we're done. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. And I think I can see the case again for doing it one last time for the Negro Leagues because they didn't get a fair shake and all. But I mean, Buck O'Neil, pretty clearly from what we know, probably doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame as a ball player.
Right.
And I think, he would have been the first to admit that. He was a pretty good ball player and all. But clearly you can make the case for him in the sort of pioneers section as this is a guy who was a great ambassador for the, for retelling the stories of the men he played ball with and all of that sort of thing. I mean, he does have a statue, but, you can certainly make the case for him going in. I mean, I'm skeptical of the executives and whatnot generally, because I think there's a fair amount of back scratching there. But
sure,
I think O'Neil certainly is a guy who had a unique position. You could put him even in with the writers or the broadcasters or something in a sense, even though he wasn't exactly one of either of those. Because fundamentally, why do we consider Buck O'Neil a Hall of Famer? Because he was a storyteller. Because he was one of the game's great storytellers. And he told an important part of the story that needed telling and that didn't get adequate telling from other people. But I think if you talk about the flip side of that, of the let's shut the door on the old dead guys who've been gone forever. The flip side of that is, come on, don't make guys wait until they're dead, right? And I mean, Leo DeRocher was the one who always said that, put me in when I'm alive, don't wait until I'm dead. And of course, they waited until Leo was dead. And
of course,
Marvin Miller. They made wait until he was dead, right? Isn't he dead?
They did. They waited.
Yeah. And they made Ron Santo, who who, unlike Leo and Marvin Miller, wasn't hated in the
Right.
game. Quite the opposite. They made him wait. And now Dick Allen is the latest example of this.
Yeah.
And Dick Allen was a rough-edged guy. He was kind of a jerk to a lot of people. He had reasons to have a chip on his shoulder for being, a black man in the time he played, and not just any black man, but he was a guy who went through some particularly difficult experiences in the minors and everything, and in Philadelphia, and and there were guys who were involved in the integration period who were, like Jackie Robinson, who were sort of admirable, heroic figures, and Dick Allen was not like that. He was a guy who inherited a difficult situation and sometimes made it worse on his own. And so, he made a lot of enemies in the game, but he belongs in the Hall of Fame. He's a fantastic hitter. And it is during the prime of his career, he was such a great hitter that it made up for the fact that he was not much of a fielder. So, I would definitely put Dick Allen in.
I'm with you on this. And I think about players like Al Spalding, who's been in for so long. No one even knows who Al Spalding is. Leon Day has only been in for a couple of decades, but no one's like, oh, thank God they've got Leon Day in there. At some point, some of these guys didn't have.
Well, I think at least Al Spalding, people know his name, even if they don't know Spalding.
Yeah, they don't know why they know his name. They just know, But yeah, you can quickly get lost in the minutia. And to the credit of the Hall of Fame, there's still the museum part where you can learn about people who aren't in. And then also, you are talking about people like Al Spalding and trying to decide why that matters 150 years later or whatever it is. But the thing about these players dying before they get in, or Marvin Miller dying before he gets in, it's just, man, I would hate to be on that. I would be like, let's just, the oldest guy who might die, let's get that guy in first. Let's let them enjoy at least the ceremony, and get him there. It's terrible to do that to Dick Allen. We got Ted Simmons in finally, and that was good. And he got to enjoy it alive, but I
can almost understand the logic, although I don't agree with it, of why they might do what I suspect they might do, which is very deliberately wait until Pete Rose is dead to put him in, precisely because they don't feel like they want Pete to feel the honor. But that gets back to, look, I'm really not a stringent, ethics and morals tests for the Hall guy. I think Pete belongs in there. I think Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens belong in there, and to the point where I think the Hall is diminished by their absence. I think these are such monumental figures in the game that it's, it was one thing when you had like one guy out, right? And you would say, Shoeless Joe Jackson, okay, right. He's out. He's the big exception. He's the cautionary tale. Right. But to have so many of these guys out, and there are guys in the Hall who cheated in ways big and little.
Of course. Known cheaters in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, and some of whom were famous for it. And gamblers and all of that. I would keep Jackson out. I would keep Jackson out almost alone among them, because he broke the one really cardinal rule, which is you play to win, right? That to me is the one line you don't cross, right? Because you can say, maybe I don't care that this guy took steroids and that guy threw the spitball and this other guy beat people up in his spare time, or even frankly the guys who were involved in the color line and some of that, which did affect the game on the field. So it's not totally an outside the lines thing. But the common thread of all those guys is they're in there because they put W's on the board, right? They're in there. Okay, yeah, Pete Rose bet on the game, but come on. Anybody who watched Pete Rose play or manage knows that this was a guy who approached he played in more baseball games than anybody else in the history of the game. And he played every last inning of every last one of them like he had money riding, right? And that was his reputation before people knew about the gambling anyway, that this is a guy who ran to first base on a walk, and he ran into walls, and he ran into infielders, and he ran into catchers. And he would do absolutely anything to get a base, to get a catch, to get a win. And in their own way, that's true of Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, too. Both of whom were jerks, even aside from the steroids thing. But, I hated Barry Bonds in the 80s. Right, going all the way back for him, like being with the Pirates and trash talking Dwight Gooden and all this stuff. But there was a part of me that always resented Bonds and Clemens precisely because as a Mets fan and coming up watching Dwight Gooden and Darryl Strawberry. And Bonds and Clemens became the guys that those two were supposed to be. That always particularly irked me. But at the end of the day, I'm fine with all of those guys in there. And, the steroids guys, part of it is too, we all know that there are going to be some guys who get in who didn't get caught. And you just don't know for certain. And it was part of the competitive conditions of the game, just like throwing the spitball, just like grabbing base runners by the belt and hiding balls in the outfield grass in the 1890s.
Yeah.
And all of this other shenanigans that have gone on in the history of the game, guys loading up on amphetamines. Are there guys in the Hall of Fame who took amphetamines before the game? Of course there are.
Yeah.
We all know that.
Yeah.
And look, if you miss the Hall of Fame because you got caught in mid-career and got suspended, well, okay, that's a different story, because you got caught, you played under the rules, you tried to get around them, you got caught, and you got punished, and that caused you to not win ball games. Well, that's fair. Okay, hold that against guys. But I don't believe in the going back and undoing this. But Shoeless Joe conspired to throw the World Series, and that to me is fundamentally different, because that's he violated the one cardinal rule. He didn't play to win.
I voted for Joe Jackson, as you know. I put him on my ballot in part because he served his suspension. It wrecked his ability to make money. He's dead, been dead for a long time, and so okay, yeah, this guy cheated in the World Series. The evidence is, strong, flimsy, whatever case you want to make about that stuff. He did hit 356 in that series, but maybe he should hit 402 or something. But he's been dead. Let's just, okay, he did that.
I went through, I actually did a column on this back in 2000, actually.
Oh, did you really?
I went through, yeah. And I went through the box scores, and, he did he did a bunch of his hitting damage in the final game, after it was 10-1 against the White Sox. And I think the pattern of his performance in that series is entirely consistent with throwing the games. When you look at where he got his hits and when he made his errors. So, he was a fantastically talented ball player. So, you can't totally turn it on and off, even the best of them, but you can turn it on and off a little.
Yeah, you can slightly throw the ball offline, ensuring that the runner is safe, these kinds of things. And no one's ever going to know that. You can swing and miss or whatever, he had enough bat control to impact how he did it and be like, I know I can still get this hit, whatever it is. Either way, as far as I'm concerned, he's been dead for long enough that he and his family will never enjoy the benefits of it. There's no monetary gain. It just closes the loop on that. And nobody else from the White Sox deserves to get in. So he would be the only guy. I'm curious what you think on guys like Harold Baines.
And by the way, the one funny thing politically is that one of the guys who sponsored the resolution in the Congress to try to get them to reconsider Jackson was Strom Thurmond.
Uh-huh.
And when I looked it up, Strom was actually in the Senate when Shoeless Joe was still living in South Carolina.
Wow.
So,
yeah, that's that's crazy. These guys haven't been gone all that long when you look at these kind of things. Like Rachel Robinson still lives, and it's crazy.
Yeah.
Such a historic part of the game. What about people like Harold Baines, who are, he's in the Hall of Fame, but he's really at best a near Hall of Famer. You had a nice career. He was, however, docked hits for during the strikes, right? So he lost, and maybe he gets to 3,000, probably not, probably still short. But if he's 2,900 plus, which is, not impossible at all for a hitter of his caliber, given the times of those strikes, is he closer because of the number? He doesn't get any better. He's just hitting his normal way, but he's fighting for something bigger, fighting for the players' rights and salaries and all that stuff. We give credit to Ted Williams and these guys that served in World War II. Are we short-sighting these players that lost significant playing time because of player union and owner disagreements?
Yeah, I'm willing to give a certain amount of leeway to the guys who missed time to strikes. Obviously it's not quite the same as Williams or some of the other guys who lost time to war, but fundamentally, the time missed to strikes is part of the competitive conditions of the time. Like the guys who missed, we'll be having the same conversation about 2020, about guys who missed a crucial part of their prime.
Yeah.
And certainly there are some guys who had maybe their best year in 81, Bobby Grich, Dwight Evans, probably both of them at least had their best years with the bat, not necessarily defensively. But so there are guys that you would look back at on the strike. I still don't believe in Baines. First of all, to say, well, yeah, you still can get him up to like 2,900 hits. It's not like, first of all, it's not like he was going to stick around longer if he was close to 3,000 hits. I mean, Harold Baines stuck around forever.
Yeah.
If you gave him back those seasons and then added and sprinkled another 100 hits, 150 hits throughout the course of his career, suddenly his numbers look a little better. But Baines was a Hall of Fame caliber player for like 1 year, maybe 2 in his career. I am in favor of, I think we should have some guys in the Hall who are there in part because there ought to be a mix of guys who were transcendent players with shorter careers and guys who accumulated value over time. You can't, like Don Sutton, I think, is a guy who doesn't get enough respect. Yeah. And maybe it is because it's tougher for pitchers, but a guy who went like 22 years and basically, I think he missed a turn in the rotation like once in 21 years,
right?
22 years, other than the strike. I think he missed time like once because he bunted a ball off his kneecap or something. But the sheer durability of Sutton is an astonishing thing. And although I don't buy him for the Hall, I think one guy who gets real close because of that is Mark Burley, who's on this year's ballot. Incredible durability in an age when that durability is harder and harder to come by. But I don't buy it with Baines. And, I think he was not valuable on the bases. He had no defensive value. And so I think, you really got to be Edgar Martinez.
Right.
He is not Edgar Martinez.
Yeah.
He's more like Hal McRae.
More like Hal McRae. Yeah. And so you have players like that, like Johnny Damon is similar. And Johnny Damon played defense, but just he ran out of gas a couple seasons too early. Otherwise, he would have had 3,000 hits. He'd have a couple of World Series rings. He'd be tougher to say no to, but as it stands, he didn't compile enough as a compiler, and he wasn't quite brilliant enough as an all-star to get in. And it's just ever so slight difference, but there is a difference there. Pedro Delgado, too. What a ball masher at his prime and a dangerous player, but there's something about he just didn't do it long enough, I think.
Yeah, one of the interesting guys, the old-timers retrospective to argue about this with is Sam Rice, right, who got closest to 3,000 hits of anybody. And Rice, he's kind of borderline. But then you realize, okay, well, he missed time to World War I.
Right.
He was in the Army in World War I, and before that, he was also in the Navy. He landed at Veracruz in 1914.
Wow. He
had joined the Navy because his whole family, his wife and children and his parents were killed by a tornado. So, if you give Rice, and he spent time as a pitcher too. If you actually start Rice's career, he had almost no hits until he was 27 or 28. Yeah. If you actually start Rice early at 22 as a regular, you had 3,600 hits or something.
Right.
And then you're talking about a guy whose durability makes it. But when you're talking about a guy who missed that much time in military service, I'm willing to give Sam Rice the benefit of the doubt.
And the 3,000 hits wasn't even a thing when he played. If he had known.
No, nobody thought twice about it.
Right. And then what about these compilers who just aren't in any way sexy? Tommy John have to get a lot of credit for pioneering recovery from the surgery and all that. You have to give him a lot of credit for that. Jamie Moyer, if that guy had had any early career success, he's at 300 wins. Jim Cott, so many credentials, but just kind of short. You could even say Ken Brett if you really wanted to stretch it out. These are guys that with any measure, like if they were 5% better players throughout their career, they would be probably locks for the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, Cott and John were only briefly great pitchers. Cott had one great year, right? And John had, he had an ERA in the ones in 68 when a lot of people were doing it. And then he had a couple big years in the late 70s. Really, he really had his best, sort of most valuable years after the surgery. He came back, particularly with the Yankees, and when he was really a hoss, throwing 270, 280 innings, winning 22 games a year. I think he and Cott are kind of close, but I never, I think they fall a little short of being, say, Bert Blyleven, who's another guy who had a similar win total, but has a much better case to have been a better pitcher.
And Jamie Moyer, any love for that case at all?
No. I used to have all sorts of fun on Twitter when he was sort of nearing the end of his career, running the, all these people that Jamie Moyer was older than. So, I remember actually getting a response from David Robinson on Twitter after I was pointing out that Moyer was several years older than David Robinson, who'd been retired for quite a few years from the game by then, and who played, quite a long career for basketball.
Yeah. Yeah. Julio Franco is another one of these guys where if he didn't take a break and if you added in some strike time, because he played in Japan, but he just played for so long.
Played in Mexico, he was all over the place.
He's probably still playing.
Yeah, he had quite a career. I mean, he had some real talent. I mean, I think what it was won the batting title with the Rangers, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And any kind of luck, he has 3,000 hits. I mean, if he gets a better contract, if there's no strikes, easily could be 3,000 hits for that guy.
Yeah, I mean, Franco obviously was not, he was a guy, he was somewhat erratic defensively, and he, maybe didn't have the greatest on base percentages like in his Indians years in his youth and all that.
Right.
He became a more patient hitter later on.
Yeah.
They certainly had an indelible batting stance.
And thoughts on Grich and Evans? You mentioned them earlier. They are both near and in a lot of cases actual Hall of Fame level guys. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have no doubt that both of those guys belong, especially Grich. And they were two tremendous defensive players. In addition to being, very patient hitters, guys with power. They just didn't, for various reasons, didn't quite put up the sexy numbers. Whether it's, the kind of the seasons where you come up a little short and get 98 RBIs, or the they tied for the AL lead in home runs in 81 with 22. And you think, well, the guy hit 22 home runs in a season, isn't that big a deal? But again, they missed a third of the season, and that was their kind of peak years offensively. I mean, Grich's, I think, numbers would look a lot better if he hadn't gotten hurt and missed like half a season, about 77. Like he was injured carrying an air conditioner, as I recall.
It's the
threw his
craziest
back
thing.
out.
And when you look at someone like Grich, if you look at like his comparable players on Baseball Reference and, just overall, like where he stands career-wise as second baseman, everybody around him is not just in the Hall of Fame, but like we're solid Hall of Fame choices. But for whatever reason, he just didn't tick off all of the things that you need to tick off to get there. But everybody around him, all the people he'd say, like, my player, I was like that. These are all Hall of Fame people.
Yeah, and the guy who's on this year's ballot, who I think obviously is the two guys who are sort of reminiscent of Grich in different ways. Well, I guess three guys really. Actually, I have on my list three guys who are somewhat similar to those guys in different ways. One is Jeff Kent.
Yeah.
And I go back and forth, but Kent's kind of borderline. But it pains me as a Mets fan to think of Jeff Kent as a guy who went out to the Hall of Fame, given sort of he became much better after leaving Queens. Which there's obviously a rich tradition of those, but I think I include Kent. Another is Bobby Abreu, who is a classic guy who just chugged along year in year out to doing the same thing. But that same thing was like having like a 420 on base percentage, and and hitting 45 doubles and 20 home runs, and hitting 300. And I mean, I think Abreu was just a remarkable ball player, a remarkable set of skills. And the third one, of course, who I think is hopefully going to get the recognition, even though he does have some sort of injury holes and stuff in his career and a bit of an odd on and off pattern, is Scott Rowland.
Yeah, he was never very healthy. He always struggled with that for sure.
Well, he like a lot of third basemen, if you look at a lot of the big third basemen, and not like the A-list, not like Schmidt and Brett, although this is kind of true of Brett a little bit, but kind of the B-list third baseman, there's an awful lot of those guys who were healthy as a horse in their 20s, and they just started breaking down right at 30. Rowland is one of those. Because, he was like a 700 plate appearance a year guy in his 20s. But just right around the end of his 20s, he started getting banged up, and sometimes banged up to missing 15 games a year, and sometimes banged up to missing like 120.
Right.
And so he's got those holes. Robin Ventura was a guy like that. Santo was a guy like that. Some of them maybe Sal Bando, Jim Ray Hart, some of those sorts of third basemen like that. So, but I think, Rowland, I think, did pretty well enough in the voting that I think he's at least getting a look. But he's still kind of a ways from building his case.
Yeah, and there's no rush with him. He's young enough, and it does seem like he will get in. And there is still underrepresentation with the third baseman in the Hall. And then, so I'm with you on Kent. I know he's a Hall of Famer, and until I look at his numbers, and then I'm like, man, I don't know. So then I forget, and then I think, oh yeah, he's for sure a Hall of Famer. And then I go and I look, and I'm never comfortable in terms of voting. When I gave you my ballot, I didn't vote for him this time because, there's things that are missing. A lot of home runs, MVP award, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, I'm open to persuasion about Kent, but I think he's definitely close enough to the line that you got to take him seriously as a candidate.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that. What about someone like Todd Helton, who has to deal with the Coors thing, but was clearly for a very long time an elite player?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're putting Larry Walker. So I think that now Walker didn't play his whole prime in Coors, so he has a little easier case of persuading people that that he was just as good. And honestly, I mean, I do think part of the problem is I think more so with Coors than other ballparks. And I think this has been true of a lot of ballparks, but I think the thing about Coors is it's not just that it inflates the guy's numbers, but I think it really does kind of degrade them on the road too. Yeah. Just the experience of trying to remember, how to hit the ball in the thin air and how to hit the ball not in the thin air, and it makes it harder for them to adjust. And I remember Bill James doing a whole thing of this about Fred Lynn, about like, you just, all of the stuff that goes into adjusting yourself to the ballpark. And then all of a sudden you move to a different place. And how do you keep doing that? How do you keep performing at that level? But Helton was and Helton obviously also not only was a Coors guy, but also had the peak of his career right at the peak of the offensive explosion.
Yeah.
So, I mean, his numbers are ridiculous and inflated, but he was one hell of a ball player.
Does he get your vote?
So I think I come, yeah. I mean, I'll read you my ballot, and obviously this doesn't include Dick Allen because he's not on the current ballot. But of the guys on the ballot, I mean, I've got Bonds and Clemens, who I don't think need any justification other than the argument about morals. Although I will say that both of them really had Hall of Fame careers before they started juicing. Right? They had already built the resume. Manny Ramirez, which is the same argument. And Manny was a monster. Yeah. I mean, anybody who saw him play knew that. Kurt Schilling, which is a different sort of morals argument, I guess, in the sense that, and I don't think it is certainly not helped Schilling that I think the BBWAA electorate is much more politically liberal than it would have been 10 or 20 years ago.
Sure.
Because a lot of you do have this divide between sort of the old-timey sports writer guys who mostly, there's some Mike Lupicas in there, but there's still an awful lot of like conservative guys there, kind of the sabermetric, frankly, the sabermetric guys of my generation, in particular, the guys who sort of came up in the early 2000s, an awful lot of them are just hardcore woke left wingers, and they hate Schilling, and that's not helping him. But I mean, Schilling he's at least close to the line on his regular season, and I mean, first of all, he's such an indistinguishable almost case from John Smoltz. But, I think his postseason accomplishments put him over the line. So you got Schilling, Roland. We discussed Kent, Abreu, and Helton. And then the last two would be Andrew Jones and Gary Sheffield.
Okay.
And Sheffield's it's an arguable case, but he was a beast. And Jones feels disappointing in some ways, right? His career started with such an explosion in the World Series, and he was so great in his 20s, and he was not the same player in his 30s. His value was so much in his defense, and he got heavier and slower and all, but he was just such a marvel. And I mean, really the best defensive outfielder I ever saw, and I saw Gary Maddox play, but he was just one of those guys where just like once every game you'd see a ball go off the bat that your brain has programmed you from watching enough baseball to say that's a hit.
Yeah.
And it just wouldn't be. And he wouldn't even break a sweat. He'd just sort of glide in there.
Yeah.
He was under the ball.
One of the things I do when I watch a game is I count how many steps the fielder will take in the outfield. And if you get above 13 strides, I'm like, damn, that's going to be a good catch regardless of the outcome. But one of the things I noticed about Andrew Jones is I would see these balls, I would clock them as like, oh, that's going to be trouble. And he'd be like this underneath it, like already there waiting. Like he just got such an enormous jump gliding wasn't even a problem. Like, he was standing still. I'm like, how did he get to this ball?
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
Just got such an enormous jump. Gliding wasn't even a problem. Like, he was standing still. I'm like, how did he get to this ball?
I'm still not sure how much of that was that ability to get that great jump off the bat and how much was also positioning and things like that. But yeah, no, he had a remarkable ability to be already there on things that other people, even going full blast, would never have gotten to.
Right. I was talking with Rob Meyer the last time he was on the show, and I was discussing with him some sort of like front office or managerial Gold Glove by being great at the predictive analysis. Like, there's Andrew Jones standing in the gap and he doesn't have to move an inch. Like, the less the players have to, the team that has the most outs with the least amount of movement required should be like the Gold Glove for the folks that do all the data analysis. Cause that's remarkable to be standing there and, like that person is standing, like if you want to defend me in softball, stand behind second base about 25 feet back and I'll hit the ball on a line to you all the time. I'll bat 0. But if you don't know that, then I'll hit 500 or whatever number it is, because that's where I hit the ball on purpose. What are your thoughts on something like that? Like, does that deserve credit to have Andrew Jones already 5 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet in the right direction before the ball's even pitched?
Oh yeah. And I think, I think one of the benefits of analytics certainly is that even if you can't totally separate out those two elements, I think the better defensive analytics over the years have managed to give more credit to guys who made it look easy or who didn't, the Cal Ripkens of the world, guys who Cal Ripken was not, he was sort of the opposite of Ozzie Smith. He was never Ozzie in the field, but, he wasn't the diving catch guy. If you saw Ripken run the bases, you knew he was not fleet of foot.
Right.
But and part of it was that not just the positioning, but that he could get away with the positioning because he was a big guy with a cannon arm and all that, at least in his younger years. But so, I think there was a greater appreciation of that. The other guy who I still think belongs in, by the way, speaking of middle infielders, is Lou Whitaker. Tremendously consistent contributor over a long period of time.
Another guy where you look around at his peers in terms of career and performance, you're like, all these guys are in the Hall of Fame. Why is Lou not there? He's almost in, he's on the cusp. And then like I always talk about players that are 80% of another player, like they're great, like Sheffield and Bonds. When they were both at their prime, you couldn't throw the ball in the strike zone to those guys. And if you didn't, like, they made their entire lineup better. They used to say, like, who was the catcher? Benito Santiago protected Bonds in the lineup. And I'm like, no. Bonds doesn't require protection. He protects you. No. He makes Kurt Manwaring 4 batters behind him a better hitter because he is so just a singularity in terms of attention. Like, you cannot walk Jeff Kent because Barry Bonds is there. And then now you got 2 guys on base and Benito Santiago's going to get a fastball because you can't walk him, and so he makes this whole lineup better. And Sheffield had that lineup defining presence where if you wanted to, you could walk him. And if you threw the ball in the strike zone, what you didn't think was a mistake, he'd turn around on you and it'd be in the seats.
Well, and you just, the more of those guys you have in the lineup too, it's more arm fatigue on the pitcher.
Yeah.
Which is part of, obviously, the reason why you don't see guys throwing 270 innings anymore, because there's just more and more of those guys in the lineup.
Right.
And it takes more pitches to get them out. And you're throwing more high stress pitches and all.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're going to need more ligaments and tendons. And speaking of the PED guys and ligaments and tendons, why are we, and not as much that, but why are we so hard on the chemical performance stuff? But it's totally fine to put a dead person's tendon or to swap tendons around your body or remove ribs from your body to, regain a career. I mean, if you need thoracic outlet surgery, your career is over if you don't get it. And we don't consider that performance enhancing in some way. Why is that?
Yeah, well, and look, obviously your modern ball player, has some major advantages over your early days of the game ball player, like antibiotics.
Right.
You don't have guys. you don't have so many guys like dropping dead from like
Sliding
stomach
pants
infection and
exist.
stuff. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you literally in the early game, you had guys who had like, they got infections and they died.
Mickey Nell had an abscess. I mean, that wouldn't happen today.
Yeah. And Babe Ruth too.
Yeah.
The abdominal abscess. But one of the arguments is, well, at least there were rules against this stuff. But even some of the steroids, the rules were kind of vague and late. I mean, you McGuire with Andro. I mean, obviously that wasn't the only thing he was taking. But, when that whole flap came up, that stuff was legal in the game. It was not even against the rules.
Right.
So, they passed a rule later on and he stopped openly displaying a can of Andro in his locker. But,
yeah. Well, and then the other thing about the steroid thing is, I don't know that anyone's ever really done any real measurement of what the difference would be. I mean, again, Andy Pettitt gets away with it by saying, I was just trying to recover. I'm sorry, you guys. But, the home run records
that's
changed.
part of the game.
Right. The home run record.
Part of the game.
Yes. The home run record changed, but not the doubles record. We weren't hitting more doubles. Why weren't singles turning into doubles? Todd Stottlemyre, remember this? Todd Stottlemyre had like torn his shoulder apart and he came back just jacked, huge muscle man, and he's like, I worked out and I worked out, made my body stronger to support my shoulder. And it's like, maybe, but it didn't seem likely. And so everybody's doing it. So it's a level playing field. And for those that didn't, God bless, but pitchers were doing it, hitters were doing it, everybody was doing it. That's the playing field. You're excelling in an area where people had access to these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the pitching side, it definitely was much more of. I think these benefits of steroids on the pitching side are much more in the nature of. I mean, are there some guys for whom it added velocity? Yeah, I think so.
Sure.
But I think the much bigger thing is the bounce back ability, particularly for the relievers, guys who are throwing smoke, 6 nights a week. But look, I mean, what did Mark McGuire get out of it? I think a lot of that for him was getting healthier too.
Yeah, he couldn't stay healthy.
But that being said, I don't buy, there are some of the sort of deniers who will say, well, there's no evidence that this helps anybody. Well, first of all these guys took this stuff and they did it for a reason. But to say that physical strength doesn't matter, I mean, we know that it helps you build muscle mass and physical strength. To say that physical strength doesn't matter in hitting for power, I mean, come on. Have you paid any attention to baseball at all? Like, have you looked at what your typical home run hitter looks like and your typical singles hitter?
Yeah.
I will say doubles, by the way, there were more doubles.
Okay.
There absolutely were more doubles. I mean, we didn't get a breaking of the career doubles record or the single season doubles record. Well, the single season doubles record is sort of ridiculous.
It's ridiculous, yeah.
It was set in Fenway, and Earl Webb got an awful lot out of Fenway Park for that. But there were some serious runs at like some very big doubles numbers, and there were a lot of those guys. I mean, what you had a lot more of, I think, was guys hitting 40 homers and 40 doubles, rather than the guys being either 40 doubles and 20 homers or 40 homers and 20 doubles.
Yeah.
So I think there were more doubles. I was citing Abreu as one of the examples of that guy who just racked up a ton of doubles. Albert Pujols, a lot of doubles.
Biggio, a lot of doubles.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Biggio. Yeah, I mean, that guy. I mean, he hit a ton of them. I think one year, Chuck Knobloch one year, if I remember right, he hit 45 doubles in like 1994 or something. One of the really strike shortened seasons.
Right.
So.
Yeah. He was a hell of a ball player until he wasn't, and then it all changed. Let me get back to the ballots. I'm curious your thoughts on other guys who were close, like Andy Pettitt. I mean, he 200 plus wins, dozens of rings. It seems like. I mean, he was.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not totally against Pettitt. I think I think I left him off my ballot mostly because I ran out of spaces.
Right.
And I think there is a case for filling your ballot to 10 these days, and maybe even adding spaces because there are, or stretching out eligibility because there are so many. so many guys who are deserving, and they tend to get overlooked. I mean, Pettitt is unusual because, obviously nobody in the game's history has ever thrown so many postseason innings.
Right.
And so, had so much of his, it's hard to just do the regular season numbers on a guy like Pettitt, for whom going that deep into the postseason was part of his annual routine.
Right.
I think I may fall on the side of putting Pettitt in. I just should have ran out of room on my ballot.
If you had a ballot and you were going to vote, I mean, I agree with you. Like you're kind of obligated to have 10 people. And then, if there really truly aren't 10 Hall of Famers on there for you, that's fine. But do you break a vote off to hold someone on the ballot? I mean, like Kenny Lofton should never be kicked off the ballot. We should be discussing this guy's career, so do you not vote for Derek Jeter, who's clearly going to get in, and give that vote to someone who you want to hold within that 5% window?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously that's one luxury of having no ballot, right? Of doing a hypothetical ballot for a guy like me is that I don't have to think in those terms.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think if you are a member and you're part of the actual electorate, these days you do have to think in those terms of who do I want to make sure stays on the ballot,
Mm-hmm.
who's in danger of falling off. But on the other hand, and maybe the voting system would be better if it was, if there was a third category of maybe, yes, no, and maybe.
Yeah.
So that the writers could at least say, you know what, this guy, I'm not ready to vote for him,
right.
but I think he deserves further consideration.
Yeah, further consideration. Okay. And then what about these players that have, solid careers? Dusty Baker, Joe Torre, these guys that aren't individually each element, they are not Hall of Famers, but when you compile their baseball life into something, Joe Torre was a near Hall of Famer as a player, fantastic manager, and then has gone on to the executive side of things. Is there room for that person in some kind of way to go in? I mean, we don't give a lot of credit for that. Otherwise, Joe Torre would already be in.
I think so. I mean, and that's been, because Torre is particularly obviously because of the fact that you've got a guy who's pretty close to having a Hall of Fame, substantial enough Hall of Fame argument on either side of it. I mean, there are guys who are in there for that. I mean, I think probably you would not put Frank Chance in the Hall of Fame necessarily as a player or as a manager, but in Chance, it's easier to combine the two, right? Because he was at the peak of his playing career. He was also at the peak of his managing career as a player manager.
Right.
And then obviously you have guys who were no questions asked Hall of Famers on one side of the ball who had a case on the other side too. John McGraw probably didn't play long enough, but he was a Hall of Fame caliber ball player, and yet he's in just as a manager. But I mean, I think there's no question for Torre. Baker, I don't know about Dusty Baker, maybe, but I think in considering Baker as a manager, I think you could certainly look at the fact that he's, also had a very significant and substantial playing career, and he's a part of the game, for so long. I mean, another guy who had an absolutely monumental baseball life, who needs no assistance from anything but his playing, is Frank Robinson. I mean, talk about a guy who was just, one of the game's real monuments. And I think maybe never quite, I mean, obviously everybody knows who Frank Robinson is, but I'm not sure he ever quite got the level of appreciation that say Willie Mays or Hank Aaron got.
Yeah, he got crowded out by Willie Mays and Hank Aaron. I mean, they're all Negro League guys who came on, and he was incredible and then pioneered in terms of the managerial side of things. Back to the big ballot, your thoughts on people like LaTroy Hawkins and, Troy Hunter is close. Tim Hudson is close. Any kind of special appreciation for these guys? Omar Vizquel, and obviously there's news about him this week that makes him a harder case, but any thoughts on these guys?
Yeah. And LaTroy Hawkins should just be glad to be on the ballot.
Yeah.
I mean, he had some good years
Yeah.
in relief, and Torre Hunter too. I mean, Hunter was a really good player, but he's not,
Right.
he's not a Hall of Famer. I mean, Vizquel, yeah, I hated to say it, but my gut reaction when that story came out was like, we're really into like Hall of Fame opposition research season. Like that, it just felt like they went and did the research on this story because he was on the Hall of Fame ballot. Look, I get it; it's tough, and there's a much bigger discussion to be had about sort of the problem of domestic violence with professional athletes, and the fact that disciplining them sometimes seems to come down to sports journalists and the teams and the leagues, when realistically that ought to be a job for the criminal justice system, and the fact that it's not done properly is sort of a symptom of a larger issue and all of that. But leaving all that aside, I don't think Omar Vizquel's a Hall of Famer. He was a good player for a long time, but he was just, he had maybe 1 year when he was a Hall of Fame quality hitter. And he was a good fielder, but I think he was a little bit overrated as a fielder. And just, I think the total package is not there. I don't think he was really a superstar level ball player that maybe some people have tried to make him into after the fact.
One final area I want to discuss is, so for a long time, third basemen were dramatically underrepresented, and that's still the case a little bit, but they've done better about correcting that. It seems that that's not as much of a problem. But now we've got starting pitchers and I read the Petriello piece the other day talking about like pitchers formed from the 70s and later are not represented at the rate that they would be historically. So we have to reconsider guys like David Cone, Orel Hershiser, David Wells, Johan Santana, all of these pitchers from these, the modern era, the last 40 years or whatever it is, because, Mark Buehrle is a great case. Mark Buehrle had a reasonable chance at approaching 300, if not even getting there, just because he was. So if he had things left, we don't know why he quit. Maybe he made enough money and he was done, but these are guys that are close. Verlander is close. These are guys that have pitched a long time, but we're not electing pitchers at the same rate. So what are your thoughts on guys like Buehrle and Hershiser and that crew?
Yeah, no. And I mean, Hershiser, I think it is tough because you have standards, right? And these guys are not meeting the historical standards,
right?
However you define them. And I do think that the standards have to be, what we have in our mind as the standards have to be adjusted, because you have to look at these guys by the standards of their time. And starting pitching has particularly changed over the years.
Boy.
I mean, if your instinct is to say that you need to have a long career, you're going to have nobody in from the 19th century, right? Because all those guys who threw 400 innings a year, other than Cy Young, none of them really stayed in the rotation more than 12, 13 years. But I'm a little more skeptical, say, of Hershiser, because I think if you and the guys of his era, because there are enough guys from his generation that make the standard, that make the cut. But Buehrle is a weird case because, the argument when you look at a guy like Santana or David Cone is these were Hall of Fame caliber pitchers,
right,
who did not meet the quantity standards, right? In various ways, whether they Santana, it was a matter of his career being short, and Cone, it was a matter of, having a bunch of holes in his career. And he too suffers from, he was having a great year in 94.
Right.
Whereas Buehrle is the opposite case. I think if you give Buehrle another 100 innings a year or 50 innings a year, he doesn't look any more like a Hall of Fame pitcher. Whereas if you stand him up next to his contemporaries, he looks a little more like one just because he had those extra innings a year that other people were struggling to make. Verlander, by the way, is a no questions asked Hall of Famer.
Okay.
I mean, to me, he's in. He's in. And he will get it because people will remember him that way. On the other hand, I think it makes it tougher to keep out a guy like Schilling, who does have those great numbers. I mean, I don't know. I'm still not totally sold on David Cone, but I do think we need to be more lenient with some of these guys. Santana, I would give a very hard look to Santana. He is tough because he's in like sort of the Dizzy Dean category of guys who are very short. I mean, I think where the biggest area we have to adjust is wins. We just have to recognize that you're going to have guys who they're just not going to end up with career win totals that look like a Hall of Fame pitcher because of the combination of shorter careers, and fewer starts a year, and just the fact that it's just harder and harder for guys to go deep enough into games to qualify, for the win rules. So I agree with the general point, but I'm not sure I'm ready to bend the standards quite far enough for some of these folks.
Yeah, no, it's right. And Tim Hudson's same kind of thing where, boy, he was a hell of a pitcher and someone you wanted on your team, but he was never the guy. It's kind of like Abreu has the same kind of problem.
Hudson. Yeah. Hudson, though. I mean, I can easily see drawing. I ran out of room for Hudson on my ballot, but he would be above Burley on my list because I think he was the ace. I mean, he was the ace of some very good staffs, and he was a big winner and such, at the time. And I think that does count for some.
Kevin Brown's another guy that we'll have to deal with at some point because if that wasn't Hall of Fame grade, even if it was short and surly, he was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, you have the steroids issue.
Yep.
But no, Brown belongs. He was that good.
Yeah, he was that good. Well, listen, I appreciate. Go ahead.
I think I would put him very much in the same category of quality of Schilling and Smoltz and Glavine and Messina.
Yeah. Actually, I want to ask you too. Like a guy like Verlander, I think only recently crossed that no doubt about it bridge. Like this renaissance that he's had the last few years. Another thing too, I figured out. I think this year was the year that killed off any chance of any current pitcher getting to 300 wins. I can't speak for the future because the game evolves, but Verlander is stubborn enough and was close enough, but he's going to lose 2 seasons and he couldn't afford that at this late age. And same thing with Kershaw, whatever chance he probably had, unless he decides to pitch to 45, I don't see it happening. Does that even matter though? Does 300 matter?
I mean, there's a ton of guys in the Hall of Fame who didn't win 300 games.
Right.
I don't think the 300 game winner is extinct, but I think it's the stars are really going to have to align. I agree with you that almost nobody who's pitching this, unless it was somebody who's like 21, 22 years old this year, but almost nobody active in their prime in 2020 is going to make it. And the 2020 lost season is going to be a big part of that. And hopefully not a partially lost season in 2021.
Hopefully.
Knock on wood that we will get 162 games in this year. But yeah, no, I think it is. I don't think it's never been an absolute requirement because there's only like 20 guys.
Right.
There's a lot more than that pitchers in the Hall. You wouldn't kick at Bob Gibson or Jim Palmer because they didn't make it.
Or Pedro Martinez. Yeah, these are guys that didn't.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I don't want to take any more of your time. I know you got to go, and it was fun talking the Hall of Fame. Let's do another one again soon. And just in general, thanks for coming on and happy holidays.
And you too, and to all your audience. And boy, let's just we'll pray for a better year in 2021 and a better year for baseball.